Welcome back, everyone, to another explainer. I'm really thrilled to guide you through today's topic because honestly, it completely reshapes how we think about environmental responsibility. Today, we are unpacking the ripple effect of ISO 14001-2026, specifically zooming in on Clause 8.1. We're going to explore how modern environmental management pushes operational controls way beyond the traditional factory floor. We're talking reaching deep into your supply chain, your contractor networks, and all the way back to the earliest stages of product design.
Okay, let's dive into this. Ask yourself, where do your environmental impacts actually start? Now, for a really long time, the assumption was that environmental management began the second a raw material hit the production line, and it ended the exact moment the finished product left the loading dock, right? Well, under the 2026 revision, that mindset is totally obsolete. Your environmental footprint doesn't just start at physical production. Actually, it starts in the boardroom, it starts at the designer's drawing table, and absolutely in the procurement contracts you sign.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start by looking beyond the factory floor, then we'll get into integrating the environment into your design phase, greening your procurement and supply, communicating with contractors, and finally, how to avoid those common audit pitfalls. Basically, we're rippling outward from the absolute core of your organization to the furthest edges of your supply chain.
All right, Section 1. Beyond the factory floor, expanding EMS boundaries.
Modern environmental management systems, or EMS, are just no longer this internal, isolated operational thing. We really have to look at the whole picture now. And this brings us to a super foundational concept, the life cycle perspective. Under ISO 14001-2026, you just can't manage the emissions coming out of your own smokestack and call it a day. This perspective forces us to look upstream at suppliers, how are they extracting those raw materials, and downstream at our customers, how is the product being used, and ultimately, how is it disposed of? You literally have to evaluate the entire value chain.
And Clause 8.1 takes this a step further. It demands structured operational controls. It is just no longer acceptable to have some dusty environmental manual sitting on a shelf somewhere. Your environmental commitments have to be transformed into practical, day-to-day operational behaviors. These controls need to be seamlessly integrated into your everyday business workflows, like how you purchase chemicals or how you schedule maintenance, if you actually want to minimize harm. Because if they aren't integrated into the day-to-day, they simply aren't going to work.
Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds. Integrating environment into design. Start at the source.
Because think about it, if you really want to prevent environmental issues, the absolute best place to start is right at the drawing board. I want you to really absorb this quote from the source material. Environmental impacts are often locked into products, services, infrastructure, and supply chains at the earliest stages of planning and decision-making. If your engineering or design teams are out there prioritizing functionality or cost without even considering the environment, you are essentially baking those environmental risks right into the product. Trying to correct a non-recyclable product or some heavily energy-intensive process after it's already in full production, that is incredibly complex and frankly, it's just very costly.
So, what does early integration actually look like in practice? Well, your design teams need to incorporate specific controls super early on. Are they actively selecting low-toxicity materials? Are they engineering the product so it uses less energy during its actual operational life? What about designing it for an extended lifespan? Or making sure it's easy to recycle at the end? Are they verifying that the raw materials can actually be sustainably sourced? Answering these specific questions during the design phase is exactly what prevents both upstream pollution from your suppliers and downstream waste for your consumers.
Okay, moving outward. Section 3. Greening procurement and supply. Supply chain influence. Now, consider how your organization's purchasing decisions directly dictate global environmental outcomes. Because when you outsource a process or you buy a material, you are effectively buying that supplier's environmental footprint. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive shift we're seeing in purchasing habits. Traditional procurement, it focused pretty much purely on cost, delivery speed, and technical capability. But Clause 8.1 procurement expects a much more holistic approach. Obviously, you still need cost and delivery, right? But now, you absolutely must add lifecycle environmental impacts, the supplier's regulatory compliance history, and their resource efficiency. If your procurement teams ignore these factors, they instantly become the weakest link in your entire environmental management system.
To actually make this happen, organizations have to take some very structured steps. First up, supplier evaluation. Before you sign anything at all, you need to assess their environmental certifications and their past compliance. Second, contractual agreements. Your environmental requirements have to be hard-coded into the legal contract itself. And third, performance monitoring. You can't just trust them. You have to verify through ongoing audits and environmental scorecards.
I want to focus heavily on that second step for a second, the contracts. Look, ambiguity here is a massive compliance failure, literally. If your vendor contract just casually says follow environmental best practices, what does that even mean? It means nothing. You cannot audit a vague best practice. Contracts have to specify precise, measurable obligations. What are the exact emission limits? What are the specific waste segregation rules on site? Without that level of precision, you're essentially stripping your own organization of the ability to enforce its environmental standards.
Next up, Section 4, Communicating with Contractors, Managing On-Site Risks. So external contractors introduce a really unique risk because they're operating on your site, but they aren't fully integrated into your internal culture. And this leads to perhaps the most sobering quote in the entire source text. Ready? The organization remains legally responsible for environmental compliance even when activities are outsourced. Just let that sink in for a moment. Outsourcing a hazardous task like waste disposal or heavy facility maintenance does not outsource your environmental liability. No way. If your contractor dumps chemicals illegally, the regulator is looking straight at you.
Because of that immense liability, communication is completely non-negotiable. Before a single wrench is turned or any work begins, contractors have to go through environmental briefings or toolbox talks that cover some critical elements. They absolutely need to know the site-specific rules. They must be trained on exactly how you expect them to handle and store chemicals. They need strict procedures on where their waste goes, and, if they're doing construction or heavy maintenance, they need crystal clear parameters on things like noise control and dust suppression techniques.
And it doesn't just stop at daily operations either. Under Clause 8.2, your contractors have to be prepared for the worst-case scenarios. They need to fully understand your emergency preparedness protocols. So if a contractor accidentally punctures a drum of solvent, do they actually know your spill containment measures? Do they know the evacuation routes? Do they know exactly who to report the incident to on your team? If contractors aren't properly briefed on emergencies, a minor spill can rapidly, and I mean rapidly, escalate into a major environmental disaster.
All right, bringing it home with Section 5, Avoiding Common Audit Pitfalls. Learn from mistakes. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing exactly where systems break down. I want you to view these common audit findings as cautionary tales for your own workflows. Look at the design phase. Auditors are constantly finding missing environmental criteria right there in the engineering specs. Over in procurement, the non-conformance is almost always selecting a supplier based solely on cost, while completely turning a blind eye to a terrible compliance history. And in contracting, the most common failure, it's bringing external personnel on-site without ever communicating emergency procedures to them.
And guys, these aren't just theoretical paperwork failures. The source material highlights some real-world consequences here. Imagine a construction contractor causing massive soil contamination simply because they were poorly briefed on the site rules. Or an electronics manufacturer suddenly facing huge product recalls because weak supplier verification allowed restricted toxic substances into their components. Or even just a simple facility contractor causing toxic runoff by using unapproved hazardous cleaning chemicals, all because no one bothered to check their supplies.
So the crucial point is this. It really only takes one weak link, one uninformed contractor, one unverified supplier, or one short-sighted design decision to completely compromise your entire environmental management system. And that exposes your organization to some severe regulatory and reputational risks.
Which leaves us with this final, really important question to consider. Are your environmental controls truly reaching the furthest edges of your supply chain? Or do they just stop dead at your factory door? I highly encourage you to take a hard, honest look at your procurement contracts, your contractor onboarding briefings, and your early design workflows today. Ensure that your environmental commitments are rippling all the way out. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.